Thank you for that overly kind greeting introduction. I'm just one of you. I mean, I'm the sort of person who would have been really happy to be living here and tried, but failed. So I've been punished. I'm living in Washington, D.C., where... your poetry recitation was just, really the best possible welcome I could have received. So thank you for that. And I guess I've made it. So I'm here in Lambert. I've been engaged in. Now I'm departing from my message. Actually, I've been engaged in the project. The project of the renewal of Catholic education. So, this is a school and a project I followed from the beginning, and so it really is deeply my honor to be here, and read about it from the beginning. So, I'm also a mountain person. I know there's beach people and mountain people. I'm afraid of the ocean, and I love mountains. So this is really, it's a pleasure to be here on every level. So I would like to say that, just to begin, that this college is, I think of it as a kind of seedbed of not just a Catholic renewal, because it is, not already, but also a deeply American renewal. And this, to me, is very important, right? So what you're doing here is also deeply American. And so this is, obviously a great opportunity and honor for me. I'm also grateful for your hospitality. I was promised a bourbon old-fashioned with my lecture, but I had to settle for having it before. But the other portion of the hospitality, I was already brought up to the canyon and Six Canyon, right? And I just found it so splendid. So hopefully I can go again tomorrow. And finally, I want to say that I'm so joyful to be here on the occasion of the inauguration of your new president, President Washington. Are you here? There you are. I was missing your hat, so you are. so congratulations. Congratulations, yeah. These are not easy times that we live in, but they are rich times for saints, and so I hope that you will be a seedbed not only for renewal of our culture, but for the saints, for the church. Okay. I'm going to get right to it. As my title suggests, drawing extensively on this book, recently heralded by the New Yorker as a cult classic. I guess it's a cult classic because you are all reading it. I just wanted to know which cult for which cult is it become a classic? This was the question I didn't want to ask the New Yorker. Nobody was more surprised than I was. But I'm going to argue there were some serious things behind this besides wanting to be a cult classic. I'm going to argue for a competing thesis about the decline of liberal democracy. And when we say the decline of liberal democracy, we need to define terms. But I will say that in some other quarters, this decline of liberal democracy is sometimes called actually the crisis of the West, because in fact, liberal democracy was born in the West. And in other quarters, it is sometimes putatively called the failure of liberalism. So to set the stage, and I will eventually get around to talking about my book, but just to set the stage, I want to recall to your mind two historic elections. The first one, I want to take you back to November of 2004. So some of you were like in diapers in 2004. This is the second Bush 43 election, which was a victory, but achieved by a very razor-thin margin. When I say Bush 43, does that mean anything to half of you? As pundits sorted through the victory, which was not predicted by many, and that may remind you of recent elections, the New York Times columnist David Brooks drew attention to a little-known phenomenon that he called the red diaper babies. So he highlighted the natalists, as he called them, that were found all throughout the country, to your surprise. These natalists, he said, David Brooks said, were defying falling birth rates, sometimes having 3, 4, or more children. It's like, wow, 3. And David Brooks said, remember, he said this in 2004, okay? So David Brooks said, their personal identity is defined by parenthood. they are more spiritually, emotionally, and physically invested in their homes than in any other sphere of life. Having concluded that parenthood is the most enriching and elevating thing they can do. Now, David Brooks in 2004 was not wrong about this, so this is 20 years ago. The Men and Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth, and published that was the title of a book in 1987, which, if you had read my book, you would know. I mean, sorry. It's buried in chapter 4. The birth dearth. No, it's okay. One of my daughters said, "Birth dearth? Mom, are you trying to be cutesy? Like, what is that?" And I said, "No, I didn't make it up." And then, of course, there's the people who are like, "What does dearth mean?" Like, oh no, this is where we're at. So the birth dearth, the Men and Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth, then in 2004 as today, they have strong reasons for what they're up to. Reasons that have to do with higher things, we would say, like Pascal's reasons of the heart. So Amanda was somebody that I interviewed for my book. She was a Mormon LDS mom with 5 children. And when I asked her, "What do your children mean to you?" which, by the way, is not the way to get a good answer to the question, "What do your children mean to you?" It worked in this case. When I asked her, "What do your children mean to me?" she said, "What do they mean to me? Everything. And nothing compares. I almost feel like this will hurt my friends who can't have children. Nothing is as good." She said of having her 5th baby, who was 3 months old when I visited her, "It's so physical, and it's the most hard thing you've ever done. And you can feel their body and smell them and look into their eyes, and it's like another person. Well, nobody will have a better impact on this soul than I will as a mother. So," she said, "when I think about all the work I want to do, to go out and speak or start a charitable foundation that helps people, which I want to do, and I'm going to do that, but nothing I ever do will be more purposeful, more meaningful, and have more impact on a human being than giving them a body and nurturing them as a human." So giving them a body is it's an LDS principle, just so you know. Giving them a body and nurturing them as a human. And because of my religious beliefs, I also know that this relationship is eternal. So for me, it's the most worthwhile thing I will do in this entire life. Is that making sense to you? I'm sitting there like, I think it's making sense to me. So David Brooks, this is who he's describing. He's in his natalist. His interest in women like Amanda wasn't mere curiosity. He wanted to draw attention to the fact that people getting married and having bigger than average families, now, average is like 1.5 now, so having 3 or more children is associated with red America, right? They were Republican voters. So Brooks cited scholars in 2004 who noted that Democrats had swept the largely childless cities, the true blue locales like San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Boston, and Manhattan. These are cities that have the lowest percentages of children in the nation, but they generally had poor showings in those places, the Democrats, had poor showings in those places where families are settling down, notably the Sun Belt cities, the exurbs, the outer suburbs of older metropolitan areas. So David Brooks urged his readers to see the, as he called them, the true motive forces behind the political divisions. The real fault lines of consequence, he argued, were familial. So just how real were these fault lines? Well, more real than Brooks even knew at the time, because 2 years later, demographers based at the University of Michigan published findings about the red and blue voting patterns in 2000 and 2004. And what they found was really remarkable. Marriage and birth rates correlated very powerfully with voting patterns. Places with high fertility and more marriage were vastly more likely to vote for Bush. The converse was also true. Low fertility locales favored non-Bush votes. If this sounds like obvious to you, it wasn't obvious to the authors of this paper. The authors stated that the correlation found in the United States between traditional family formation and the percentage of votes for Bush in 2000 and 2004 is, to our knowledge, so I'm quoting them, the highest spatial correlation between demographic and voting behavior on record. And these demographers are based at the University of Michigan, but they're of European origin. They have looked at the same types of phenomena in Europe. So the message was that families were voting red and non-families were voting blue. So fast forward, I said 2 elections. So fast forward to 2016. This is you're now out of diapers, I think, right? In 2016, okay. You're out of diapers. I don't know if you're in college yet, probably not. This is the Flight 93 election. So Michael Anton, under the pseudonym Publius, in a very influential essay, which was dripping with contempt for the never Trump establishment conservatives, wrote the following: "What has conservatism achieved lately in the last 20 years? The answer appears to be nothing. And it might lend credence to the plea of these old guard conservatives that our ideas haven't been tried, except that the same conservatives who generate those ideas are in charge of selling them to the general public. If their ideas haven't been tried, who is ultimately at fault?" Anton described Trumpism as a vote for life against death. He said, "Trump alone, among candidates for high office in this or the last at least 7 electoral cycles, has stood up to say, I want to live. I want my party to live. I want my country to live. I want my people to live." And this, to Michael Anton, meant broadly secure borders, economic nationalism, and America First foreign policy. The election of 2016, he said, would be a test of whether there is any virtue left in what used to be the core of the American nation. The election would be a struggle for life over death, charge the cockpit or die. So, of course, you know what happened. He wrote this essay before the election. Trump won, and this shocked both the never Trump conservative establishment and also the liberal elites in both parties. Bewildered news media issued hand-wringing and confusion. Anton's pencil sketch narrative of failure was swiftly filled out by a team of conservative academic counterinsurgents, elites in their own right, epitomized by Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. For the petulant conservatives joining these ranks, Trump's election was not quite something to celebrate. Sure, we had narrowly avoided a pedal to the metal on the entire progressive left agenda. It seems like that's good. We're safe for now. But Trump's election was an opportunity more than a victory, an opportunity to press for a full failure narrative. It would be no more business as usual for conservative principles, defined, if you want to know, by the, quote, household gods of the reigning conservative think tanks, such as the Heritage Foundation. I understand you had Kevin Roberts here last night, who's a good friend. So out with the Heritage Foundation's work of the 1980s and the 1990s, including such things as limited government, fiscal responsibility, low marginal tax rates, pro-business regulation, free trade abroad, and pro-life, pro-family legislation at home. No, old-fashioned conservative principles, at least those principles, would be bundled up and labeled for the failures that they are. Weak priorities at best, hypocritical at worst. It was alleged for a managerial class getting fat on the backs of ordinary Americans. Winning is what we want, Anton said, and if you haven't noticed, he said, our side has been losing consistently since 1988. So the counterinsurgency aimed to take back conservative from a failed zombie Reaganism. So Trump wasn't their guy, but he served a purpose. Patrick Deneen argued that Trump, while flawed, represented, and I'm quoting from his book, today's widespread yearning for a strong leader, one with the will to take back popular control over liberalism's forms of bureaucratized government and globalized economy, after decades of liberal dismantling of cultural norms and political habits essential to self-governance. So they couldn't fit Trump into the new conservatism. I mean, he's not really a normal conservative. So they settled for calling him a populist and a change maker. In a nutshell, the 2016 election of Donald Trump represented a new political era, a mandate for regime change, and a fundamental realignment. Meanwhile, hidden from the politics of hope and change, those University of Michigan demographers were still crunching the numbers on voting patterns. They found that family demographics, right, who's getting married and having children, at the state level and at the county level, were still the best predictor of the red-blue voting patterns through the Obama years. And they showed that the patterns of this prediction started converging in the 1990s, and they said with substantial correspondence after the year 2000 and continuing up through the 2016 election. More specifically, they wrote, after the turn of the century, correlations were observed between 0.8 and 0.9, these are spatial correlations, for no less than 5 successive elections. These are huge associations in statistical terms. These authors offered no theory about the causal channel from family formation to voting, but the authors urged caution in assuming that the Trump election was a novelty. The patterns they observed had been remarkably stable, and the Trump election was no exception. Family behavior, like who's getting married and when, and composition by the turn of the century, so like right when you guys were born, becomes an excellent predictor for a state's position on the red, blue, or Republican-Democrat continuum for all subsequent elections. Just as an aside, in case it's not clear to you, a reason during those years why a state or a county might switch from red to blue is because people pass away and people move away, right? So if, say, families in Wyoming move to Texas, right, that may change the voting pattern. So basically, the thing is, if you follow where the families are, this is where you can see the votes change. And they looked at all the other potential predictors. So what this means for the leitmotifs of Anton's sketch, it's not entirely clear. I don't want to make this simplistic. At a minimum, whatever his conclusions about the fate of the old-fashioned limited government conservative positions, it seems that Trump did represent a vote for life against death, because Trump was elected by voters, actually alive and creating life, against the living dead of the non-reproducing classes in this country. The fault lines of consequence in 2016 had not become, as the narrative alleges, economics and nationalism, as the counterinsurgency hoped to prove. There was really no realignment. Families still voted red, and non-families voted blue. What Michael Anton did not say, but nearly did, is that only a virile nation could charge the cockpit, a manly nation. Anton had said a nation with virtue. Properly speaking, that's a nation of husbands, a nation of fathers. And fathers did just that. What the correlations tell us is that traditional family formation, more marriage, less divorce, more children, less childlessness, is a vastly better predictor of voting patterns than any other economic or cultural indicator that we have. So we're limited in what we can measure, but that's what we have. The upshot of this is that we should not be so quick to agree that it's a story of decline that brought us the Trump 2016 vote. It may just as well be interpreted as a story of thriving, of those optimistic family men and women who have hope for the future, enough hope for the future and belief in the future, to get married and have children. Such men and women want to safeguard what we have for the future, so Trump's forward-looking optimism seemed appealing. I mean, this is an alternative narrative available to us, as well as his promise to stand in the way of those trends which threaten the natural family. But such an attitude wants nothing to do with regime change. In fact, it wants to conserve and advance the greatness of the land of liberty. As an aside, if demographics are where the political action is, as I've argued, unprincipled immigration is certainly something to cause a charge the cockpit or die situation. Some of the narrative of thriving voters can certainly be overlaid on top of Anton's motifs. My point here is not that Anton was wrong about the election. My point is that he and the architects of the failure narrative may have misinterpreted the vital forces at play and ran with a jumbled narrative about the nature and causes of our decline and the likely sources of our renewal. The failure narrative asserts that, I'm quoting, the cultural norms and political habits of self-governance were drained away by liberal principles present from the get-go in the American founding. Unbounded freedom, corrosive individualism, and agnosticism about common goods, a kind of liberal neutrality. But the failure narrative has failed to take into its view the fact of really existing families, communities, and neighborhoods that are not in decline. I'm looking around this room. This is not a picture of decline, right? What do these communities like yours have in common? Is it a rejection of liberalism as Deneen defines it, or is it something else? So the competing thesis that I want to put on the table tonight, and sometimes two theses are both in play, but the competing thesis that I want to put on the table about the failure of liberal democracy, drawn from the research from my book, is at the same time darker and more sinister, but also gentler to the American experiment. I argue that norms, habits, and virtues of self-governance, vital to the success of a free and democratic nation, were instead whittled away by the deliberate rejection of human reproduction, of marriage, since marriage just is that institution ordered to giving life. Giving rise to new life is, in fact, like the philosophical form and the basis for all other self-governance, because it is an identifying act of free submission of the self to the other. Life-giving marriage is the form and basis of what we call ordered liberty, the freedom for of the American project. In short, smaller families issued the meager virtue of our time, and in turn, the trouble we have with liberal democracy. So I'm going to tell you one story from my book, and I think her story begins to illustrate what I'm going to get at. So I interviewed Hannah and her best friend Esther together. They were Trump voters. They were Jewish, right? Trump voters. And in spite of living in an area of the Northeast that went overwhelmingly for Clinton in 2016, Esther's husband had greeted us with his Jewish beard and hair, wearing a bright red MAGA hat. When I arrived, he grinned and he said, "Was my study to make fertility great again?" I don't have this on tape because we weren't rolling the tape at that point, but it was a great memory. So Hannah, these were two that were interviewed together. Hannah had a 12-month-old daughter with her in the interview, and this was her 7th baby. And Esther was nursing her littlest one, who was 2 weeks old, her 9th baby. Esther had grown up in a big family and always envisioned having kids, but Hannah didn't plan for this life. Hannah told us, "I didn't even want to get married at one point in my life. I could not see myself married. I thought I would be like, the medicine woman who doesn't get married." She continued, "When I was in my early 20s, I was just doing my own thing for whatever I was doing at that point in my life." She said, "Most people in their academic years," that's you guys, "or in their professional careers are just doing their own thing. And having children was not something, well, if you're somewhat level-headed in the world, you would say this doesn't fit into that lifestyle. You couldn't do this. It doesn't make sense." Because people think on rational levels, and maybe a little bit more super rational thinking has to infiltrate the masses to know that things are possible, like possibilities of expansion in your life. Hannah was from a Reformed Jewish background where she didn't even want to get married at one point in her life. Reformed Jewish, by the way, is like where you call yourself Jewish, but you don't really do any Jewish things. I mean, their words, not mine. Okay. All right. Hannah's search for meaning led her to the idea that children are the meaning of everything. She told me, we were searching. My husband and I, we were searching. For us, we had both been around the block. We had explored. We had dated in our public school, secular life. We were both very clear and focused that one of our main goals of getting married was to begin a family right away and to have a large family. That, but also on a deeper level, in my own quest for meaning and purpose. I didn't have time to tell you, but she spends all this time traveling around the world looking for, like, nirvana. She's, like, meditating on the beach in Hawaii. Anyway, she lands in Israel. She says, I was on this search for the concept of infinity, like, what's the meaning of everything? And I learned that it all came down, like, the core of the answer was that children are key to infinity. And especially being Jewish, how much more so, because this is a link and a chain that we've had from Moses and from Abraham and Noah and Adam. And this link, continuing this legacy by having children, is a way to be part of this chain of infinity. And to me, that was it. There is nothing else that's going to do that. When I was listening to this, I was like, can I just get that on tape? And I was like, get that again. She said, yeah, this was not just this idea about infinity. She said it was specifically religious for her. She said, it became something through my learning and through my meditation and through my wanting to serve God as a Jewish woman, that having children is the answer. This is what I was being called to do as a servant of God. Her contrast between two ways of life, her old self and her new self, provides the foundation for the thesis, this competing thesis. My subjects describe their choice to have many children as a deliberate rejection of an autonomous, customized, self-regarding lifestyle in favor of a way of life intentionally limited by the demands of motherhood. They were motivated, in general, by a deeply religious or biblical worldview characterized by trust in God and hope in his providence. Like Hannah, my subjects they groped, they didn't have them at hand, they groped for descriptions of the life they had rejected, where the number and timing of children were fitted into a story of your own self-identity. Instead, they thought of themselves as fitting into a narrative of childbearing. They spoke of self-sacrifice, but not of losing themselves. They believed they found themselves in having children, and that their personalities and capacities expanded, indeed so richly as to give rise to new persons. Like Hannah, the women that I met extended this contrast to their marriages, to their children, and to social order more broadly. They believed that living with needy young children for an extended period of time fosters other regarding virtues necessary for egalitarianism, civic friendship, such as empathy, generosity, solidarity, and self-denial. Like Hannah, my subjects described a life of religious seriousness in which they allowed their beliefs about God and the meaning of life to shape their own hearts and desires. And finally, like Hannah, they had adopted a posture of openness to children as a way of life and not a limited season of life. Hannah's contrast between her old self-regarding life and her new other-regarding life raised the issue of individualism. People doing their own thing, she said. Recall that Tocqueville defined individualism as a mature and calm feeling which disposes each member of the community to sever himself from the mass of his fellows and to draw apart with his family and his friends. Tocqueville, like Hannah, also used the imagery of a chain. Tocqueville argued that aristocratic societies, full of class and title, right, tied people together, with everyone playing a role in relation to everyone else, right? You knew where you were in the chain of relations. And this is why he worried about democracy in America. Tocqueville said aristocracy had made a chain of all the members of the community, from peasant to king, and that democracy breaks down that chain and severs every link. So you just have these loose links, right? Tocqueville worried that democratic orders necessarily initiate a degenerative shift toward corrosive individualism. For Tocqueville, individualism isn't the same as selfishness, which he called exaggerated love of yourself. He thought that individualism was like a judgment, an erroneous judgment, that you're sort of sufficient from everybody else. And he believed that this erroneous judgment about being sufficient could give way to selfishness if there wasn't a countervailing force, such as the aristocracy. So he looked at democracy in America. He thought, what's the countervailing force? So amazingly, Hannah, who as far as I know had no political theory background, she just uses this language of the chain. She argued that the family serves to link everybody like a chain. The family, in her view, works against individualism by asserting a communitarian reality. In a single generation, an individual has parents and grandparents, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, cousins, nieces and nephews. These are the real flesh and blood human beings who make up society outside of your immediate family. So you don't have to wonder whether you care about your fellow man. You do care, because your fellow man might be your actual brother, your uncle, or your son. I don't know if this is true in Lander, but it is definitely true where I live in Maryland. There are many, many households in the same neighborhood with relatives across the street or nearby. Moreover, across generations, individuals have ancestors to whom they have debts and offspring towards whom they have responsibilities. So childbearing kind of cancels the debts, as it were, right? I can't repay my parents. Can't repay your parents. But if I have children, it's a way of repaying them, right? Because I paid it forward. Having children, according to Hannah, conferred an eternal status on any one individual in the chain, making her equal in dignity to all her kin for all time. She said, continuing the legacy by having children is a way to be part of this chain of infinity. So the family is egalitarian. Everyone's equal, in a sense, who's participating in the chain. Communitarian and hierarchical, all in one. On this account, ties to the family redeem our freedom and direct its powers. The self-imposed duties of an abundant, generative family life provide the ballast against those selfish forms of individualism. So with strong and stable families, democracy in America might have a chance of fostering the public and private virtue that Tocqueville worried about. Hannah's familial chain is a perfect image of the paradox that she and my subjects described. And she's Jewish, and I'm bringing her to you in part because she's not coming from our tradition. But the Catholic women would say, it's like the paradox of the cross. They would say, right, you have to get on that cross, and you do it willingly of your own accord, but then, of course, it has all this fruit. But it was very interesting to hear the same type of paradox described in other words. A single link in the chain cannot do its own thing. You are on the cross, right? But the link is not alone. The link knows where she's been. She knows where she's going. She finds her purpose in the strictures of its ties. Towards the very end of that interview, Hannah said to me, everybody's searching for an identity. Tattoo yourself, pierce yourself, take on another religion, but everybody's got an ancestry. What a way to honor your legacy and your line. What a way to connect the past and the future. That, to me, is being a part of infinity, to continue a chain. So what a better way to form an identity, And she added to me, she said, I have no regrets, not one. I mean, this is way harder than life was back then, but I have inner peace in my life that I didn't have then. I was searching. I'm not searching now. So as my subjects described it, Hannah's chain was not a burial ground as much as a seedbed. The moms that I interviewed likened families with many children to a type of rich soil for the soul, in which the habits of right living, the virtues, were germinated. So Monica was a Catholic mom on the West Coast, and she had been a promising young litigator. She had a very dramatic story about how the first couple kids, she was trying to get back to her lawyer self. She felt like she was turning into a mom, and then she would try to get the lawyer self back again. It's like the whole battle. She finally gave up on that, just became a mom. She said, I see a lot of kids who don't have the qualities, the virtues that will serve them well as adults. They're badly formed young adults, because I think not just the small family, but the philosophy, the approach that comes with it, and the focus on the wrong things, in particular material things, the selfish ambition, the training of young people to be very lost in themselves. They're overly focused on themselves because of the way they've been taught, which is that they are of the most importance. And they're oddly disconnected from others. They're lacking the ability to relate to others well, and also the problem solving, the self-sacrificing, all those wonderful virtues that leads to either no marriage vocation or to a serious challenge if they do get married. Because of those qualities of being able to serve others and sacrifice for stuff, to work around problems, to get through things, to understand an individual's different qualities and temperaments, and to work with it. It's all those wonderful skills that are learned in a large family. So Monica didn't blame John Locke or any other liberal baddie. In fact, not a single mom cited any political ideology, unless feminism counts as one. They were unsparing in their descriptions of a self-centered, individualistic America, but they didn't fault theories about rights or freedom, race or creed. Instead, they blamed the way we grow up. Monica's observation reminded me of something that one of the older moms in the study had said. So a mom named Donna, with 8 kids ranging from 28 to 10, explained it this way. She said, having children, even my first baby, opened my eyes to something I hope I can express well, she said. Ever since having my first, ever since then, if I see somebody who's handicapped in some way, somebody with Down syndrome, somebody in a wheelchair, somebody who is poor, I think, that could be my baby. That could be my baby. You can't just dismiss somebody and try not to think about them or marginalize them in a way, because you realize, well, if you're open to life, you realize that could literally happen, where I could have a baby with this or that condition. The logic of her realization, that could be my baby, could be extended also to her children. That could be my brother or my sister. So Maggie, a Catholic mom of 6, made that inference explicit. She told us, one of the things our parish priest said to us one day, we were picking up kids from school, and my oldest son grabbed the baby, and he was walking around with the baby on his shoulders. And the parish priest said, look at him. That's what we want. That's what we want around here. We want big brothers knowing how to carry a baby and being proud of younger sister. And Maggie said, for me, it wasn't really a big deal. Like, he carries the baby all the time. He changes her diapers. He puts her down for a nap. That's just a way of life for us. But from that priest's perspective, he doesn't see a lot of big families or a lot of big brothers kind of loving on a little sister. And for him, it was like a moment, which I thought was interesting. Maggie believes that carrying the baby isn't anything special. It's a way of life for her son, a habit that he picked up in daily living, and it would profoundly shape the man he would become. Maggie's story recalled to me the iconic photo and caption from Father Flanagan's Home for Orphans in Nebraska. It was called Boys Town. As the story goes, in 1918, a little boy named Howard Loomis was abandoned at Boys Town. It was an orphanage. Polio had left Howard crippled. He had heavy leg braces. Older boys at the home began carrying Howard around. In 1921, a well-known Omaha photographer named Louis Bostic, he captured this common sight, which was little Howard on the back of a bigger boy named Reuben Granger. He took this photo, and to this photo, later, Father Flanagan affixed the phrase that later became the unofficial motto of Boys Town. You've heard this. He ain't heavy, Father. He's my brother. Of course, Howard wasn't the boy's biological brother. He was an unwanted orphan with warped legs. But in helping Howard, the young men found out the meaning of their strength. And the bond between the strong and the weak took on a brotherly character in which the strong received more than they gave. In the business of diagnosing what's wrong with this country, it's easy enough to name the symptoms: egoism, individualism, separation, loneliness, anxiety, alienation. People doing their own thing, like Hannah said. But perhaps the way to sum it up is lack of a brother. Someone you put before you, someone you carry. This doesn't have to be a biological brother. It could be a brother like Howard had a brother. But the most natural school of brotherhood, like what's a school of brotherhood, is a brother if you're a boy, or a sister if you're a girl. And by the way, if you're going to have at least 2 boys and 2 girls in a family, you're going to have about 5 or 6 kids, 4 plus extras in case you get more of one or the other. An unintended consequence of having a large family is that your children of both sexes are more likely to have at least one human being of their own sex that they can call brother or sister. The testimonies in my study suggest that a lack of fraternity and sorority, the state of growing up without a brother or a sister like you, may matter more for the character of our nation than ideas left to us in old books. But there isn't even a word in English for that. Interesting. The phenomenon that we heard was roughly the same throughout our interviews. Somebody more needy needs you, like little Howard. There's no way out. You have to meet those needs because you brought them into existence. So grudgingly or not, like the middle of the night, you rise to the occasion. And it looks like all the giving is on your side, but you figure out that you're the receiver after all, because you discover your purpose, your meaning. And it wasn't just the kids who matured by having babies around. It was the moms and the dads. They had to become grown up for their children. And if they succeeded, they became more attractive to their spouses. Like, that seems like a good outcome. And they became better workers and neighbors, better sons and daughters of God, right? Everybody wants to know the secret sauce. How do you keep the spark alive in marriage? One mom said, if you're going to have a lot of children with a man, he's either going to become a jerk or a rock star. And she said, my husband became a rock star. So if the women in my study believe that the Lord repays them for their gift of self, they also believe that virtue is one of the rewards that spills over to their marriages, to their communities, and to the nation. On their account, and follow the logic, on their account, virtue wasn't victim to freedom. Virtue was victim to the principled sterilization of our families. Principled because it was chosen for its own sake. It didn't fly under the flag of liberal value neutrality. We wrongly came to believe, and now I mean this in the broadest possible sense. I actually didn't bring all the examples I could have brought, but largely all Christian churches in this country came to believe that smaller family sizes were a positive good for better marriages, for responsible parenting, for a productive economy, and for a more fulfilled adulthood. One mom named Eileen said challengingly, it's hard for me to understand family life as being good with an intentionally chosen small family. She said, and this is so not acceptable to say. This is, Eileen is a pseudonym. But there's a selfishness there that you're not going to burn out of yourself with a small family. And to have a whole society that is not only not growing in the virtues that a big family demands, but also not doing it as a point of principle. So it's not even accidental, like we've just fallen into this. It's almost like it's become a cultural principle, either because of environmentalism or because it's just not valued to nurture a big family. So that shift, it's almost more alarming, the principal change of what the nature of the human being is and what it is to love. So the moms said that smaller families were better for us was just false. It was a mirage. It looks like the real deal, but only on the surface. Deep down, it's not fulfilling. Or worse, it prematurely fulfills the part of us meant to grow up and keeps us in a perpetual adolescence, such as the litigator Monica trying to keep her mom self from ruining her lawyer self. So, the country got on the wrong track, they argued, when it bought into a neo-Malthusian paradigm that more people could ever be a problem for a marriage, for a family, for an economy, or a nation. It got on the wrong track when a type of overly planned parenthood, bookended, by the way, by deliberate sterility. Like, how do you have your kids in those 3 years right there? You start marriage sterile and you end marriage sterile. Became the norm for a marriage. No longer did we pray, and we do not pray as a nation, like the biblical Hannah, to be set free from barrenness. Instead, we apply our cleverest technologies to give impotence the reign. Holding her 2-week-old newborn, Esther said quietly, "You know, my understanding is that all blessings come from God. And the 3 big blessings we talk about in Judaism are children who bring us pride and joy and follow in tradition, good health, and financial sustenance. I don't feel like you could ever have too much of any of those things. These are blessings. They're expressions of God's goodness. We can put up roadblocks to not get those blessings, but those are the blessings." And she paused and she said, "Sometimes we need to ask God to make ourselves proper vessels to receive the blessings. But those are the biggest blessings." So to conclude, I want to say that for all of his insight in 2004, recognizing that the demographic trends were vitally important, David Brooks got one very important thing wrong in his column. Brooks argued that, and I'm quoting, "the differences between the natalists," I guess that's us, it's me at least, "the natalists and the people on the other side of the cultural and political divide," Brooks argued, "are differences of degree and not of kind." That is not right. People who think you can't have too many children are obviously different in kind. It's not a small difference. It's the kind of difference that will firmly reject all abortion and euthanasia. It asserts that the child is lovable and wantable. Economic logic be damned. Because the image of God is in every child, and moreover, God took flesh as an infant, and not only as a man. People who think you can't have too many children will organize their lives around the ability to receive the blessing of children by pursuing marriage earlier, planning their careers around their children and not the other way around. This difference will tend to go along with a culture of hospitality, of welcoming strangers, whether the stranger is in the womb or a Sunday visitor. People who think you can't have too many children will prioritize the needs of children in policy and politics and not the needs and wants of adults. It's the kind of difference that rejects the very idea of responsible parenthood, as if too many children could be irresponsible in a marriage. I don't mean to say that there wouldn't sometimes be good reasons to postpone children, but to call postponement responsibility is already a value judgment against children. People who believe you can't have too many children will confidently assert and trust that God will provide for the children he sends. Correspondingly, it's the kind of difference that sees a growing market economy as fundamentally good and not exploitative or suspect or requiring special justification. Fathers have a sacred duty to provide for their children, and in what other way does God intend for that to happen than by hard work and a reasonable expectation of growth? People who think you can't have too many children will treasure thrift and wise spending in a nation, because what is good for a household is also good for a nation. People who believe you can't have too many children will favor smaller government because they will understand intuitively that the family is the first society prior to the state, the society of a man and his wife and his children. So the state cannot give too much assistance without tending to undermine the natural authority and responsibility of the father. People who believe you can't have too many children will prize liberty for the sake of family responsibility, the invitation to do and to be everything for the dependent spouses, children, and family in our lives, and to take our turn as the dependents in the cycle of life. So freedom for dependence, not from dependence. In sum, believing that you can't have too many children gives rise to a very particular set of principles, oddly similar to the ones embraced by the brand of conservatism that didn't produce any winning since 1988. These principles aren't wrong, and they never were wrong, but they are the reason conservatives are now divided. Probe a little deeper, and you will find that families still believe in these putatively conservative liberal principles. Non-families don't, because non-families look to the power of the state and the community at large to provide the securities that families are meant to provide. And if you don't believe me, pay attention to the realigned conservatives calling economic growth into question, rejecting as naive the optimism of market economies. Look into the attitude of the realigned conservatives towards family size. Is there any truth more hard-won than this one? That a nation committed to redistributing benefits cannot be committed to open family sizes any more than it can be committed to open borders. So all this leads me to say that if David Brooks got one important thing wrong, Michael Anton and Patrick Deneen got one important thing right. We are divided in a deep way. There is a struggle between two different ways of life. We are in a charge the cockpit or die situation. But I say the enemy isn't liberalism as they've defined it. It's not the liberal elites. It's not the managerial class. It's not the obviously problematic hordes of immigrants and global trade, and not even the childless cat ladies. And I am not here to defend any of those things. But I want to say that the enemy is a desire not to live, right? Anton said, it's people rose up and said, I want to live. It's a desire not to live that resides first and foremost in the human heart as an unwillingness to accept natural fecundity. This is a kind of sickness that replaces a divine wisdom, be fruitful and multiply, with a merely human wisdom, Planned Parenthood, a path that leads, I say, inexorably to lack of self-governance. First in sexual matters, then in failed marriages, then in a failed path to marriage, then indeed in civic life, for those habituated to putting self over others will inevitably put self over others. And finally, in the next generation, raising children who lack the virtues that arise in an abundant family life, and who in turn put off marriage and childbearing even further. The typical age of first marriage today is closing in on 30. You realize that? I won't be 30 here, I suppose. My son got married last year. He was 20. No alcohol at his wedding. But the grandmas on both sides were like putting it in his trunk. It was great. What ails us is not, if you followed my logic, it's not freedom per se, but it's something we're mistaking for freedom, which is being detached from family obligations. And those family obligations are actually the demands that save us from egoism and despair. We're like loose links jumbled together in a scrap heap. It's not liberty that we have too much of, it's disintegration. You can't solve a problem of disintegration by turning freedom into the enemy. You have to learn where integration comes from. So Hannah Arendt in 1958 wrote, "Only the full experience of natality can bestow upon human affairs faith and hope, those two essential characteristics of human existence. She's talking about integration. Integration comes from natality, from embracing the call to be linked up forever in a family chain. Today, as it ever was, it is Abrahamic faith that provides the motive and the spiritual resources for childbearing. It's not easy. It's not easy. Hannah Arendt continued, it is this faith and hope for the world that found its most glorious and succinct expression in the few words with which the Gospels announce their glad tidings. A child has been born unto us. So I say liberalism really failed because people who inhabit liberal orders today are no longer integrated human beings. They didn't become disintegrated by accident. It was a specific set of ideas and choices that we can name, and I just named them. So my work aims to bring these ideas and choices to light in service of a real understanding of our time and a credible path to renewal. We don't need to wait for regime change. If we love our country, we can keep our country. What we can't keep is the lie that childbearing and virtue can be had on secular terms. They cannot. But with abundant families nourished by strong churches, democracy in America might still have a chance. Thank you.